Well, good evening, everybody. I think we've left the 2 academic minutes so we can get started. It's great to see you all this evening on a wet Bologna evening. Thanks for coming out. And I think you will be rewarded with an extremely interesting and timely discussion. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Paul Taylor, who is making his 3rd visit to SAIS Europe. He was one of the first visitors when I rejoined SAIS Europe a few years ago, and was very happy to welcome him back. And in those years, he has been extremely active in reporting and analyzing contemporary development in Europe. Paul is a senior fellow of Friends of Europe, one of the main think tanks in Brussels, and a freelance correspondent for The Guardian that some of you probably read online. And he was previously, for many, many years, correspondent for Reuters and for a columnist for Politico. In recent years, he had, and most relevant for this evening's discussion, he's published 12 studies on European defense and security in the framework of Friends of Europe. And many students have these on their reading list and will be familiar with them. His most recent report, released in June 2023, was on the defense of Europe after Russia's war in Ukraine. Paul's background goes back to Oxford, where he did a degree in history and modern languages at Balliol College before joining Reuters, where he spent in all nearly 40 years. He was a correspondent in London, Paris, Tehran, Bonn, Brussels, Jerusalem, Berlin, and Cairo. And then in Brussels, covering European politics, economics, defense, and diplomacy. So he's really got an almost unmatched background from which to address some of these issues. From 2016 to 2023, he wrote a regular column under the name Europe at Large for Politico EU. This evening, Paul is going to discuss with us, to engage with us on this slightly provocative subject, the possibility of Trump-proofing Europe. He insists very much that it's Trump-proofing Europe, ? But we hope that during the course of the discussion, we'll be able to remove some of those question marks. Those of you who are following online, please feel free to put your questions into the chat, which I will relay to Paul. And we will have ample time for Q&A afterwards here. The floor is yours, Paul.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's a delight to be back in Bologna again, back at SAIS. And as you said, when you suggested that title to me, I said, as long as there are enough question marks. And then so you sent me back an email with the title with question marks. And I said, couldn't you translate it into Spanish so that we could have an upside down question mark in addition at the beginning? Can Europe be Trump-proofed? And is an autonomous European defense and security capability at last possible? Well, I'll try and answer those questions and probably add a few as I go along tonight. There's nothing like a sharp stab in the back to get you moving. When Donald Trump said last month that he'd encourage Russia to do whatever it wanted with European NATO allies that don't meet the alliance's defense spending target, he sent a rather sharp and salutary, in my view, jolt across Europe. With Vladimir Putin doubling down for a long war of aggression in Ukraine, periodically threatening the West with nuclear war, and jangling frozen conflicts such as the one in Moldova, and the Republicans blocking further military aid to Ukraine at Trump's behest, that was really all we needed. Yes, I still say salutary because there's a palpable sense that something is finally moving in European governments' attitudes to defense. Not fast enough to be sure yet, not fast enough to supply Ukraine with the ammunition, air defense and long-range missiles that it desperately needs, nor in a sufficiently coordinated way to rebuild European nations' own sorely depleted armed forces, nor in a way that's likely to yet avoid waste and duplication in the way that they spend their extra defense budgets. Still, I would say there are some encouraging signs. Call it a glass half full, if you will. It's probably somewhat less than half full, but it's still being filled up. Let me start with a flashback into history. The European nations that formed the EU fought each other for centuries, culminating, or so we thought, in the horrors of two world wars triggered by German expansionism and revanchism. In 1945, European countries were in ruins physically, economically, and in many cases morally as well. Soviet troops dug in where they had reached at the end of the war. American forces stayed put in Western Europe. NATO was created in 1949, as its first Secretary General famously said, to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. European integration was born at around the same time out of a determination to make it impossible for France and Germany to go to war with each other again. Maintaining a large American military presence in Europe, accompanied by the enlightened investment of the Marshall Plan, enabled and protected that project, especially in the light of the permanent Soviet military presence in what we now call Central Europe, but we then thought of as Eastern Europe, on the other side of the Iron Curtain. The West Europeans decided to manage coal and steel, two of the essential ingredients of mid-20th century power, in common, with the British, even then, staying aloof and clinging to a supposed special relationship with the United States. What is less well known is that a first bold attempt to unite 6 European nations' militaries in a European defense community in a treaty signed in 1952 failed in 1954 because the French Parliament was still too hostile to the prospect of German rearmament and feared a loss of national sovereignty. That was less than a decade after the end of World War II. The EDC, and if you look at the treaty, it's quite an extraordinary document, would have entailed a far-reaching military integration than anything that's under consideration today, with a common budget, with common armaments, centralized arms procurement, and an organic link to NATO. It was a road not taken, that remained blocked for decades. Instead, West Germany was accepted into NATO, and European integration proceeded as an exclusively civilian economic project. Partly as a result, many people in Western Europe, especially in Germany, came to believe that war could be abolished through trade, economic interdependence, common regulation with supranational governance, and a rules-based international order under the United Nations. What's not to like? As long as the Cold War lasted, NATO's protection under a US nuclear umbrella suited everyone. Didn't always suit the Americans, but they always stuck with it, even if the French marked their singularity by quitting the integrated military command in 1966 and insisting that their nuclear force was a purely national weapon of last resort, able to strike in all directions, as they said. After the Berlin Wall fell, the future of NATO became uncertain. Would the Americans stay? Should they stay? Did we still need a military alliance without the Soviet threat? Shouldn't the Europeans take care of their own security? Had the hour of Europe struck? Well, in 1992, the Maastricht Treaty called for a common foreign and security policy. That's better known, that treaty, for being the thing that led to the single currency and creating an economic and monetary union. But it also called for a common foreign and security policy, leading to, and I quote, the eventual framing of a common defense policy, which might in time lead to a common defense. Almost as many question marks as in my title, I think you can hear that. In 1998, France and Britain, the continent's two nuclear powers, agreed at a summit in Saint-Malo that the Union, quotes, must have the capacity for autonomous action backed up by credible military forces, the means to decide to use them, and the readiness to do so in order to respond to international crises. In 1999, the following year, at a summit in Helsinki, the EU agreed to establish a 60,000 strong rapid reaction force, deployable within 60 days and sustainable for up to 1 year in the field. None of this ever came about. The EU subsequently reduced the level of ambition to the creation of multinational battle groups for crisis management. But while some of these exist on paper and have held exercises, they've never been deployed, not least due to lack of agreement on who would pay for the cost of such operations. In the EU's strategic compass agreed 2 years ago in 2022, so after the start of Russia's invasion, full-scale invasion of Ukraine, member states aimed more modestly for a 5,000 strong rapid deployment capacity for crisis interventions. Obviously not enough to stop the Russians for more than a couple of hours, but more considered for areas outside Europe, in North Africa, perhaps in the Middle East, where sudden intervention might be needed, or some kind of deployment to rescue Europeans, things low-level engagements. Several member states remain reluctant to commit even to that because they're concerned that it shouldn't detract from their contributions to NATO's very high readiness joint task force. So there are several reasons for the failure to create a credible autonomous European defence capacity over the last 30 years. Shrinking defence budgets after the end of the Cold War and until 2014. Foreign policy differences, after all, how can you go work on a common defence if you don't agree on the policies that it's to support? I mean, think of the differences between France and Germany on the one hand, and the UK and Spain on the other, over the 2003 Iraq War, the US-led invasion of Iraq then. And the absence of a common strategic culture. In other words, we didn't agree about how you use hard power. In some cases, perhaps, over whether you should use hard power at all. The EU was and remains the quintessential soft power, exercising global influence through regulation, the so-called Brussels effect, through the attraction of its model of market-based integration, and through trade and aid. It has remained, until very recently, a vegetarian power in an increasingly carnivorous world. Can Europe be Trump-proofed, you ask, Michael? Well, the essay topic on my exam sheet tonight is a much wider question than just about defence. There's much to say about what the EU needs to do to make itself better prepared to cope with the eventuality of a second Trump presidency. He would likely be more hostile to the EU and to multilateralism in general, more subversive of democratic institutions and the rule of law at home and abroad, more destructive of trade, data protection, and economic cooperation, more vandalistic towards climate change policies, and probably more vengeful towards individual European states and politicians he perceives as foes. And there would probably be fewer adults in the room in Washington to restrain him. We can talk about some of that later if you like, but I would like to concentrate in my introductory remarks on defence and security. Well, I don't need to tell you that Europe's security environment has deteriorated radically in the last decade, since Russia seized Crimea and fomented war in eastern Ukraine. We now have two hot wars on our borders, one in Ukraine and one in the Middle East. Both are directly affecting our political and economic stability, the cost of living, supply chains, control of our borders, our energy supplies, and our internal democracy and the stability of our societies. Think about the differences between Muslims and Jews and how they're playing out in some European societies. Russia is already waging a hybrid war against NATO and the EU and their member states, including in the destabilizing conflicts in the Sahel belt of Africa, but also through disinformation, sabotage, and so on in our own, and by financing corruption and political radicals. This has driven European leaders to significantly increase defense spending, to use the EU for the first time to pay for weapons and coordinate some ammunition purchasing. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine triggered a reinforcement of NATO's Eastern Front and the first permanent deployment of French and German forces right up to the front lines in Central Europe. But everyone agrees that Europe currently is neither able nor really willing to meet Ukraine's immediate arms and ammunition needs without the United States, nor able to field credible conventional armed forces to deter Russia. That has led to a serious rethink of how Europe does defense. The French call this strategic autonomy, the ability to decide and the capabilities to act collectively when the United States and NATO are not involved. That terminology alienates many in Northern, Central, and Eastern Europe who cling to US protection as their sole real guarantee, as they see it. Some kid themselves that Trump doesn't mean what he says because he didn't pull out of NATO or Europe in his first term. Others would no doubt seek bilateral deals with Washington to try to shield themselves from Hurricane Donald, as they did during his first term. But there is a growing recognition that Europe needs to do more collectively for its own defense, both within NATO and, if necessary, without Uncle Sam. It's gratifying to see some of the ideas on European defense that I, along with others, have been touting for several years in my Friends of Europe studies and media columns, are starting to be taken up seriously. I suspect it's as much out of anxiety over Trump as it is out of heartfelt support for Ukraine or fear of Putin. But whatever the motive, it's good to see previously heretical ideas starting to go mainstream. Mention but a few that I've advocated in recent years. Closer practical cooperation between the EU and NATO on a range of defense, security, space, and cyber, or a whole range of subjects. This was something that was anathema before 2014. Joint European procurement of arms, ammunition, and possibly enablers such as strategic lift, space capabilities, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance systems, air-to-air refueling, communications, logistics, and infrastructure. All of these things are finally being talked about seriously, and in some cases starting to happen. Joint European borrowing to fund a major common defense procurement initiative. Now that hasn't happened yet. The Germans and the frugal Northern Europeans are quite resistant to the idea, but you know, if you look at the history of our wars in Europe, they've all been financed on tick and not only from existing budgets. Britain, as an example, finally finished repaying its World War I debt in 2012. That's 100 years later. So, you know, there's form there. Most wars are financed, and not just wars, but defense, pre-wars are financed on credit. Putting European defense industries on a pre-war footing with long-term contracts for defense companies to expand production, to keep redundant available capacity where needed, and the power to turn civilian plants to military use. All of these things, again, unthinkable a couple of years ago, are starting to be thought about, and you'll hear more about a lot of those things tomorrow when Commissioner Thierry Breton puts forward the first European defense industry strategy in Brussels. Adapting the EU's code on sustainable investment to incentivize instead of deterring investment in the defense industries. Removing barriers to transatlantic armaments cooperation, such as excessively restrictive US technology sharing and arms export regulations, known as ITAR, and restrictive EU rules on access to the European Defence Fund. Incentivizing defence innovation via the European Defence Fund and NATO's Diana incubator. One could imagine those two starting to work together. Looking for cheap, quick, off-the-shelf technology solutions rather than focusing excessively on hugely costly major weapons platforms that have the elephantine gestation periods, very long development cycles. Greatly increasing whole of government and whole of society preparations to cope with hybrid warfare, strengthening the resilience of our energy, communications, and transport infrastructures, combating disinformation, teaching people how to recognize disinformation, how to read media, and so on. There's still a long way to go on all of these, some of which remain for the moment ideas or proposals rather than policies and actions. But we spent too many years debating and identifying what capabilities and structures we need and where the key gaps are. We know that already. The important next step is to work practically with the defence industries, potential investors, and public authorities, EU, NATO, US, national, to break down the barriers to making this work. Now, I hear you say, although you haven't had a chance to speak yet, defence is a profoundly national domain in which the EU long had no role whatsoever. Things are changing, but there's still dogged resistance from national defence ministries, which are used to dealing with their own suppliers in a purely sovereign way. However, I think a lot of governments are starting to realise they need to go further and tap the efficiencies of scale that can only be achieved by long-term investment and collective purchasing. They've done it with vaccines. They've done it with ammunition for Ukraine to an extent. Now they need to do it for themselves. The European Commission is creating new instruments with significant funding to provide new incentives for joint procurement. They can promote research and development, give bonuses for multi-country orders, perhaps facilitate exports to third countries by a US-style foreign military sales scheme. There'll be some big announcements, as I say, from Thierry Breton on this tomorrow. It probably won't move forward until a new commission is in office with a new European Parliament later this year. And some member states may fight it tooth and nail, seeing it as another Brussels power grab. The key relationship in all this, in my view, will be between the EU and NATO, because it's NATO, not the EU, that has operation-ready command structures there, decades of experience in training and exercising, technical standards for interoperable equipment. The EU, for its part, reaches parts that NATO doesn't reach. It has money, which NATO sorely lacks. It has the instruments of industrial policy. It has tools such as sanctions and the vetting of exports and investment. It has cybersecurity regulations and teams. It has counterterrorism expertise and valuable assets such as the Galileo positioning and navigation satellite system, the Copernicus Earth observation satellite network, and a planned low Earth orbit constellation of secure communications satellites, our answer to Elon Musk's Starlink. What the EU does not yet have, but needs, is space domain awareness capability. To oversimplify massively, the only way that a European country knows if something's about to hit or somebody's about to attack one of its satellites is if America tells them. A couple of European countries do have some elements of space surveillance capability, but they need to work to be knitted together into a seamless European network. The taboo on cooperation between the EU and NATO was broken after Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014. A series of joint declarations have widened the areas for cooperation, most recently to include space, amongst other things. But while daily staff cooperation has become dense, the two organizations still cannot share classified information due to the Turkey-Cyprus diplomatic deadlock. If strategic autonomy means strengthening European forces and capabilities within NATO, with the means to act independently when the US and NATO are not engaged, it makes sense. but it will take a decade of hard work, breaking national taboos over pooling and sharing of equipment, convincing our own publics that spending well over 2% of gross domestic product on defense every year for the foreseeable future is an essential investment in their freedom and security. Populists and Russia sympathizers are already arguing the contrary, and you'll hear a lot of that in the forthcoming European Parliament election campaign. For a study I published last year, I interviewed the chairman of NATO's military committee, the alliance's top military advisor, if you like. He's a Dutch admiral called Rob Bauer, and he said it would take Russia 4 to 7 years to reconstitute its forces after the beating they're taking in Ukraine. That gives us a window to make sure, A, that Ukraine prevails, and B, that we can build up our deterrence against the possibility of a future Russian attack or blackmail. There are lots of difficult questions that I leave. For example, how would the Europeans deal with nuclear deterrence if Trump withdrew the US nuclear shield from NATO? Would France and the UK redefine the mission of their limited national nuclear deterrence to cover the whole of Europe? Would that be credible? Would other Europeans want or accept that? Would it be credible to the Russians? More questions than answers for now, but I think we can perhaps discuss this later. My final thought is that more and more Europeans, at least among the policy elites, understand that if Europe doesn't boost its military power credibly, it will be on the menu of an increasing number of global predators and assertive regional powers. The fundamental question is whether they will have the political will and leadership to do something decisive about it. History provides ample grounds to doubt that, but EU leaders have shown once again during the pandemic and during since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, an ability to find solutions under extreme external pressure, which would have been impossible under normal circumstances. The alternatives, an unseemly rush to buy bilateral insurance from Trump, or a neutered Europe permanently prone to Putin's threats, are just too awful to contemplate. Michael, I'll leave it there. Apologies for my voice. I've had a cold and I'm sounding even sexier than usual. Sound like Charles Bukowski.
That was terrific, Paul. Thank you so much. You managed in just 25 minutes to condense half a century of European history, looking at the current challenges, but also giving some perspective as to where we may be headed. And also, despite all of the tearing of hair that we have these days about Europe, the situation so depressing and so on, you nonetheless managed to be upbeat and I would say optimistic about the prospects for cooperation in the future. Maybe I'll just throw out one question about that before opening it up also to people following us online. I mean, this tremendously rich menu that you provided towards the end of your talk about what ought to happen. We're building scenarios in one of our courses as to what we think could happen. Which of these menu items do you think are the most promising? If you were to look ahead 5 to 10 years, where would you expect Europe to be in the area of security and defense by then?
Thanks, Michael. Well, I think that the whole area of joint procurement, joint weapons development, and joint procurement both for Ukraine and for ourselves is very promising because we need it, because industry will only make the investments that they have to make. I mean, they're pretty much running at full capacity now. They have to build new factories. They have to build new production lines. They have to recruit and train new workers. They have to source the materials for this. Now, it's like if you were somebody, a business person who decided to open a business in making face masks at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, You made a very bad bet because you probably got it up and running towards halfway through the pandemic, so you could sell a few. Then all of a sudden, nobody wanted face masks anymore. Nobody under the age of 75 wanted face masks anymore. So you were stuck with a production line of business with staff and so on, and no prospect for your future. Well, defense industries won't do that. They won't go there. Their costs are much greater. They have problems attracting investment. They're not attracting, to perhaps people of your generation, the idea of why would I invest my money, my savings in the merchants of death? It's not, it's instinctively, spontaneously an attractive prospect, and is it ethical? Is it moral? Is it good for the environment and so on? But do we need security? Do we need some defense? These are questions which are a bit uncomfortable. So I think that's the most promising, because it's also where the European Commission has levers. It's the fiddly bits, in the engine room, where they can change the incentives, where they can change regulations, they can change the balance of advantage in favor of collective action.
Thanks, Paul. I think that's very useful and salutary as well for our students and others who think about this issue and who tend to imagine, when they see the question posed, that we're talking about, will there be a European army?
Yeah.
And you explained very clearly that one has to begin somewhere, and the somewhere is upstream in the areas where Europe has real competences. And this is more likely to be in the area of industrial cooperation in different forms than it is to have its very own military capability.
Yeah, and I think that, there's obviously been great resistance to the idea that Europe should set up its own headquarters and have its own command structure that's somehow parallel to NATO. And back in almost 25 years ago now, the EU and NATO negotiated a set of arrangements, terribly complex arrangements, called Berlin Plus. And what they do is allow the EU, under certain circumstances, to call on NATO planning capabilities, NATO command capabilities, and NATO assets to run European security and defense operations. They haven't been much used, but they are there. And NATO has this expertise. It's all there. It has chains of command and so on. To replicate that would be hugely wasteful and time-consuming. And what we really need is more guns and more planes and more drones and more, military capability, not more commanders.
I can't resist just one more question, abusing my position as chair before opening it up. But, in Brussels, I've told people very often that when there are discussions in the institutions, people are not supposed to refer to my country. They say, because they're supposed to represent the overall European interest, they always say, the country I know best. Well, with Paul, I think we can both say the country we used to know best. Not unrelated to Brexit and so on, Paul is now a joint French and British citizen. And I share the nationality of our rector, having lived in Belgium for many, many decades, and Belgian as well as British. But this really leads me to the question, how much difference has Brexit made to the possibility for the EU to go ahead in these areas? Do you think Britain would have been an obstacle had it still been there? And related to that, looking ahead for the future, do you think we can count on rebuilding cooperation between the UK and the other European countries and the EU, given the kind of threats that we face today?
Yeah, and I think Britain would have been have had both feet on the brakes as it did, having launched the Saint-Malo initiative, which I described with Tony Blair as Prime Minister. Really, once the European Defence Agency was actually set up in 2004, with a Brit as the first director, they starved it of money and staff, and they didn't want it really doing anything very much because their instincts remained absolutely national. So I think they would have, they allowed, when they'd already voted to leave and were on their way out, but were still members. they allowed the European Union to go ahead with something called permanent structured cooperation in defence, PESCO to the aficionados of EU acronyms. And that is a whole range of more than 50 joint projects with by coalitions of countries, with one national leader in each of these coalitions, on everything from developing secure radars to developing maritime surveillance aircraft to things that are very small to very things that secure field communications, all of these sorts of things which fill gaps that that are there at the moment in the European militaries. The Brits, I think, would have thrown sand in the works wherever they could. This has gone ahead. They would certainly have obstructed joint borrowing, I think, for joint purchases of vaccines, joint borrowing for the EU next generation EU recovery fund from the COVID pandemic, and they would probably obstruct joint borrowing for defence as well, were they member states. But in fact, there are signs, I think, the beginnings of signs that the next British government, which is likely to be led by the Labour Party, will take a more practical approach to cooperating on defence and security with the EU, very much because of the Ukraine situation, the Russian threat. Britain has been one of Ukraine's most active supporters, perhaps arguably its most active supporter. Not that it's given the largest amount of money, but certainly relative to its GDP, it's a very high contributor. And I think that, a lot of the theoretical difficulties between Britain and the EU collapsed in terms of, practical cooperation when, as soon as the invasion happened, they immediately sat in the same room to talk about sanctions and reached, pragmatic agreements. And I think that the next British government will be much more pragmatic. They'll have to start by doing a limited number of things that the Conservatives weren't willing to do. For example, reaching agreement on exchange of confidential information and data, reaching an administrative agreement between the UK and the European Defence Agency. But I think they'll do these things. After all, the United States has got one of these agreements. Canada's got one of these agreements. If Uncle Sam can have it, then surely the UK can have it.
That's Paul. Of course, they don't dare mention this before the election, but I think afterwards it's very plausible that they'll get into these forms of cooperation. Who would like to ask the first question? Briefly introduce yourself, your program, where you're from, and ask a question, please.
Hello, my name is Fabian Lang. I'm currently an MBA student, so I'm the Master of European Public Policy and have a focus on transatlantic security too. First of all, thank you for your interesting talk. You spoke a lot about that Europe needs more tanks, planes, and other stuff, other conventional arms. What you didn't talk about was nuclear deterrence. And I don't know, I see a situation where Trump or any other American president casts serious doubt, or even more serious doubt, on the American commitment to NATO and the Article 5. Also problematic in the regard that in Europe, when we look at France and Britain, both of them conduct some kind of minimal deterrence approach regarding nuclear policy. And any event where the American security umbrella would not be present in Europe anymore could make all other European states very, very vulnerable to put in, for example, nuclear bargaining. And I wonder what you think about ideas of whether Europe buying its own nuclear capabilities or financing France's forced grab to extend the French nuclear umbrella over the rest of Europe. Thank you.
Thanks. Do you want me to take
Oh,
one by one?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think I was sure the nuclear question was going to come up. Thanks for that, Fabian. So I think let's start with the non-starters and kill them off. You can't fight nuclear war by committee of sovereign states. So I think we can exclude the idea that the EU could buy an EU nuclear deterrent. Whose finger would be on the button? What would be the release procedures? Would you have to have an emergency Zoom conference of the European Council? And what if Mr. Orban didn't agree? No. So I think that we can exclude that. That leaves us with the European nuclear powers that we've got. Now, remember that nuclear deterrence doesn't necessarily rest on the certainty that a country defending or that had nuclear weapons would use them under any particular circumstances. Nuclear deterrence rests on the fact that an adversary cannot be certain that they wouldn't use them, and therefore cannot be certain that a conventional action would not lead to nuclear Armageddon. So I think that the answer has to lie with Europe's existing nuclear powers, even though, as you rightly say, they have a sort of minimum deterrence strategy at the moment. And yes, I think it's imaginable that those countries could be, through cooperation, brought to issue, let's say, a broader definition of under the circumstances under which they might consider using their nuclear weapons, and to say in some way that their vital interests don't stop at the Channel or at the Rhine, and that they consider the whole of Europe to be an area of vital interest. Then would they have to do something more to make that sort of declaration credible? Probably. They would probably, the French have only submarine-based and aircraft-based nuclear weapons. They got rid of land-based missiles. The British basically are entirely submarine-based, although they also have the capability to deliver US nuclear gravity bombs. So they would probably need to do something more and develop some sort of tactical nuclear weapons, if you like, nuclear weapons that could be credibly threatened in circumstances other than a strategic exchange. And then the question arises of who would pay for it and who would decide when they were used. And ultimately, who would decide when they're used could only be the sovereign governments of France and the UK. Whether they might ever, what they might be induced to do would be to make some sort of joint declaration about it. That doesn't mean they would decide together on the actual use, but they would make some they might make some declaration. That's something which I would advocate, that I could imagine people that I've known within the British and French military and nuclear diplomatic political establishments could conceive of. How satisfactory would that be to you as a citizen? Let me imagine for a moment that you happen to be a citizen of the Federal Republic of Germany. How comfortable would you feel?
Personally, I would be kind of okay with it, but if it would be, for example, Olaf Scholz or another prime minister of a European country and put in threatens to me nuclear Armageddon, I would not be very sure about it, because basically I have nothing to counter it.
Right. Well, the question then is also, what would you be prepared to pay for that? And in what coin would you pay for that? If you're buying protection from your European allies, they wouldn't necessarily want you to pay for their nuclear deterrent directly. They might want you to contribute towards it, but since they have the finger on the button, it's difficult to imagine. But they might say, we will only do it if you do this and this and this in terms of your conventional rearmament, if you do this and this and this in terms of your willingness to allow, for example, collective borrowing in order to rearm Europe. And so you could imagine trade-offs. Europe works on trade-offs. You could imagine trade-offs where Germany paid in some different coin for a greater level of nuclear ambiguity from France and Britain. Let me leave it there.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Several requests for the floor. I think you were first, and then we'll come to Professor Gilbert and those.
So thank you, Professor. So my name is Lilia Kubert, and I'm both French and Romanian. It's useful information for my question. I would be curious to know what your explanation is as to why Western European countries, such as France, for example, are more prone to engage in a European military capability than Eastern European ones when they are geographically and also in terms of means less threatened than Eastern European countries. Do you think it's only a question of economical means, or what is your interpretation for this reason? Thank you.
Interesting, as they say in America. I think that the further east you are, the closer to Russia you are, the more you see your salvation only in the world's nuclear superpower, the United States. And therefore you're very suspicious of whether, European defense integration or European allies would give you sufficient security. And if you're Polish, for example, you will remember that the British and the French before World War II gave you security guarantees that ended up being not worth the paper they weren't written on. They were written on when Hitler marched in 1939. So they said they would, and they declared war on your behalf. They didn't actually do anything about it. They didn't really come militarily to your defense. And so, I think that kind of thinking informs the countries of Central and Eastern Europe closest to Russia. And, also a feeling that, they've seen America during the decades where they lived under Soviet or communist rule. They have seen America go to war, use its armed forces abroad, and so on. They have really not seen that of the West Europeans, except perhaps for France and in Africa to a limited extent, or Britain and the Falklands. And so I think there's also that question about, how credible are West European armed forces. Now, West Europeans, I think there's a longer history of working together in NATO, working together in the EU. There are habits, there are patterns of cooperation. And so all of this is new. And remember that when countries like Romania or Poland, joined the EU, they were escaping from an empire. And they, didn't therefore instinctively necessarily want to join another empire. And if they wanted to join any empire, it was the sort of the benign long-distance American hegemony that felt safer to them, more comfortable than the hegemony of their European neighbors. So I think that all of that explains why the mentalities are different in the East and West of Europe.
Thanks, Paul. Professor Gilbert.
Thank you, Paul and Mr. Taylor. It really was a fascinating discussion. I wanted to, it seemed to me you're proposing among the things I teach, history of European integration. And it seems to me you're proposing a very drastic change of psychology. Because the history of European integration, you gave a very good account of the history of defense policy. But the history of European integration has been essentially about building a civilian power Europe, right? And this, in a sense, culminates, I am old enough to remember, as I'm sure you are, when we were talking about normative power Europe and Robert Cooper and all this kind of thing, and building a commonwealth of civilian powers that would stretch to Vladivostok. Now, everything you said suggests that world has come to an end. Is it plausible to suggest that we will go back on 60 years of carefully building up a certain psychology in the field of international affairs?
That's a very, very, very good question. I mean, yeah, I think that circumstances are making us change our mental compass very fast. And whether they're making us change it fast enough is a good question. But, you know, is it changing? Yes. Could we have imagined 2 years ago Europeans using EU money to buy weapons for a third country? No. You know, we created something called the European Peace Facility, a euphemistic name if ever there was one, in the EU budget, sorry, off budget from the EU, but within the EU financial framework, in order to help African countries essentially with their security. We've ended up hijacking this thing, giving all the money to, or almost all the money to Ukraine, and then pumping it up twice since the start of the war. So we're doing things that we never thought we would do. And where does that stop? I can't tell you. I just think that, you know, the European Commission, which Michael worked in for 40 years, doesn't have a military bone in its body. It's just not in its ADN. Yes, we've built up, you know, an international EU military staff. We've built up an EU diplomatic corps, although that doesn't necessarily mean the use of or wielding power. But yeah, it's true. You know, I mean, when I asked the director of the European Defence Agency, so how many people have you got working on ammunition procurement for Ukraine? And he said, oh, about 12. The German government's arms procurement agency has 8,000 employees, and that's just one member state. Now, you could ask what the hell they've been doing for the last 40 years, and especially for the last 30 since the fall of the war. You know, they don't get very high marks for efficiency, let us say. But you know, the European Union is going to have to buy in this stuff. It's going to have to bring in massive numbers of national experts. DG DEFIS, as it's called, Defence Industry and Space, the Directorate General, that is supposed to be in charge of this defence and space industrial policy, you know, is tiny, and it will need rapid expansion, rapid strengthening with officials from member states and so on. But you were asking more about a cultural change, and I think that the cultural change is coming, but will it come fast enough? And what will it, you know? In Germany, I've seen a lot of change of mentality since that extraordinary speech, and credit where credit's due. I think he's, you know, been pretty rotten recently. But Olaf Scholz gave a remarkable speech when he talked about a Zeitenwende, a change of times, and a real turning point. And you know, he was quite explicit about that, what that was going to mean. Unfortunately, he hasn't been very strong in the after-sales service of his own idea, because the domestic politics are not good for him, and particularly in his own Social Democratic Party. You know, and as an old Zotzi myself, I can feel in the bones. You know, we're the peace party. We're the party of brotherly love, and we're the party of change through trade and change through rapprochement, Wandel durch Annäherung, you know, all this stuff, and it's unthinkable that we would be, you know, the party of rearmament and militarization of Germany. Well, you know, if they can't stand the heat, they're probably going to have to get out of the kitchen. And you know,
Italy too.
Italy too, absolutely. I think, you know, I know you've written a lot on the history of Italy. Italy too, you know, Italy does an awful lot, a lot more stuff, but it has, you know, been involved in more interventions and external interventions, but it also sort of tends to do so with a semi-civilian hat on, with Sant'Egidio, you know, spreading the love, and the Carabinieri being everybody's favorite, you know, policeman and so on, rather than with the hard power side. And of course, when you're home to the Vatican, you know, you have a lot of tree huggers around. But you know, the reality is that life is changing. Life is changing very fast. And I think, you know, more and more in the elites, people are waking up to this, and I think more citizens are waking up to this. But there's certainly a big mental change to be undergone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. We've got a lot of requests for the floor, so we're going to take 2 or 3 questions together. Yeah, please.
Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm Oscar, and I'm Italian, half American, so I'm a bit the black sheep here for this argument. But I wanted to ask you your thoughts on PESCO. I was listening to talk about it before. And do you think PESCO is like the good start for this idea of the EU being more strategically autonomous? I know it has had some failures. I know it also had some external partners outside of the EU. And how would that actually factor in strengthening European security? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hannah?
Thank you. My name is Hannah. I'm from Germany. I'm studying international affairs here. I'm wondering, so a bit more on the German traffic light coalition. Recently, there seems to be this like cannon or butter debate going on in Germany. And a common argument I've seen, at least in some newspaper columns and so forth, is that citizens are just not going to accept these higher defense spendings without also an expansion of the welfare state, having this like warfare welfare state. So I'm wondering if you agree with that, or if you just have to maybe just swallow bitter pill for once. And if you agree with that, what role does the EU play? Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. And in this round, we'll take one more question.
Thank you so much for this evening's fascinating talk. My name is Francesco. I'm doing an MEPP and I'm Italian South African. I'd like to ask from the perspective of, not to put the global South into a monolith or anything, but from the perspective of countries outside of Europe that are looking in and observing this situation and how rapidly it's changing. How do you think, like European missions were sent to the Central African Republic and to Mali before the coups happened, where European soldiers were training government forces in those countries. But how do you think the EU can better mitigate its image on the global stage when we're here now busy starting a militarization process that's going to take us?
Thanks, Francesco. Well, rather diverse questions. Paul, one about PESCO, one about the fiscal space for spending more on defense and whether citizens would go for any cuts in the welfare state that might imply, and then the EU's image outside Europe.
Yeah. Thank you. Oscar, is PESCO a good start? Bits of PESCO are a good start. The bit of PESCO that I think, there's been some good PESCO project led by the Lithuanians, I think, on cybersecurity, which has delivered results already. There's a good PESCO project led by the Netherlands, which is just beginning to produce results on military mobility. Now, what's military mobility? It's getting rid of all of the obstacles to actually moving armed forces in a rapid and efficient way across Europe. So that basically means reinforcing Eastern Europe if we need to do it. Because in the Cold War, you would drive on a German motorway or on any road in Germany, and every time you saw a bridge, there would be a weight limit thing where you would see, the height limit and the weight limit, whether you could get a tank over it or not, and so on. And likewise with rolling stock, with railways, all of this stuff, it was all calibrated for potential military use. In the Autobahns, there were removable central reservations or no central barrier at all, so that you could use them as landing strips for aircraft and so on. All of this was planned in the last 30 to 35 years. We have allowed grass to grow over all of that, and we need to do all that stuff again. You need extraordinary permissions to fly or transport ammunition and weapons over internal borders with the EU. You may be able to send food or toilet roll or whatever across in trucks without them being stopped and so on as part of the internal market. It's not true of military goods at all. There were terrible incidences when, for example, during the Libya, NATO's air campaign in Libya, where Germany decided to stay out and abstain. They wouldn't allow NATO to fly military equipment or ammunition in through German airspace. Now, of course, you could think, well, there's one logical reason for that, because if it were to crash and there were to be an accident, the government would be liable and they would, and so on. But essentially, this was the kind of, what can I say, niggly pacifism that endured. So, cleaning up all of that through this military mobility project and making sure that our bridges are capable of taking military transports, our railways that our hubs are properly protected, all of those things. That is about creating a credible defense strategy. And it means you don't have to have divisions and divisions of tanks sitting there on the front line waiting for the Russians not to come, because you know that you can get your forces there in time. Whereas at the moment you have no such certainty. So those are sorts of good things. A lot of the other things are vanity projects that will wither on the vine, but some of them are worthwhile. Hannah, guns or butter? The idea, I mean, the Germans had this idea at one stage that, instead of saying that we were going to spend 2% on defense, they would say we were going to spend 3% on defense and development, right? And, so for every extra oil that we spent on defense, we would have to spend an extra oil on development. I don't know whether it was the Zordis or the Greens who had that smart idea. But, the fact is, I can only say the expression that was used a lot in British films during the early 1940s, don't you know that there's a war on? Hasn't it dawned on people that there is a war being fought less than 2 hours from Frankfurt? What more will it take for people to realize that Europe is in a war? And we may not be actually under attack ourselves, although we are through non-military means of the hybrid warfare that I described. But, we are, Ukraine is fighting on our behalf. It's defending our freedom too. Now, German politicians need to balls up and say that. And it's interesting that it's the old pacifists, the Greens, who are saying that most openly. Robert Habeck and Annalena Baerbock, much more so than the Social Democrats. And the Liberals who say it, but then they say it can't cost anything. So they don't want more welfare spending anywhere. And Germans are going to have to swallow a lot of stuff. They're going to have to swallow more collective borrowing as well. And that may mean that they're going to have to change their constitution and get rid of the debt brake for defense. And that's a lot of change. And if this lot won't do it, they'll have to get out of the way. They'll be kicked out of the next election. Now, that's not, German public opinion is not there yet, although more of German elite opinion is getting there. But that's the reality. And we need to spend a lot of time working with our German friends to understand that reality. Because I understand, there's a great Willy Brandt quote, which I love. I'm very old, so I covered the Friedensbewegung, the peace movement in Germany, as it arose in the late 70s and early 80s. And Willy Brandt, when he was asked about, well, what do you think about all these people demonstrating against American nuclear weapons? And he said, ich habe schon Schlimmeres gesehen, als dass junge Leute für den Frieden aufstehen in Deutschland. So I've seen worse things in my lifetime in Germany than young people standing up for peace. There's a whole mentality there, an allergy to all things military, an allergy to the whole notion of war that is brought. But we cannot allow Germany's war guilt to make us vulnerable to Putin's aggression. Can we?
And question about how all this is playing outside of Europe.
Francesco, I think that we work a lot with Africa. I think that Africa has to be a major partner, and it has to be a real partnership between Europe and Africa, and not just a sort of donor recipient relationship with Africa. But our African friends have to understand that just as they want us to help them when their security is at risk, as they do when when they're fighting jihadist terrorism, or when they're fighting instability, and they want us to support and help train their military. They have to understand that they need to give us some level of support when our security is at stake. And yet, they've been sitting there on the fence, and in the case of South Africa, cozying up to Russia. Now, I know the historical reasons. Russia was supportive of the fight against apartheid when many in Western Europe were on the wrong side or too neutral. But strong historical reasons for that. But, our freedom and democracy is at stake in Ukraine. And therefore, when we expect our friends to have some level of support and understanding for us, just as we have for them.
Thank you, Paul. Now let's see, because there are so many requests, you've stimulated so much interest. We have time for 2 more rounds. We'll start with Professor May. I'll try and make
I didn't want to ask a question, just to add to Willy Brandt's quote. The problem was not the quote that he has seen worse things than young people fighting for peace. The problem was that he let Helmut Schmidt alone when it came to the decision of the dual track decision and the Pershing deployment. It was only 6 people in the party executive who supported the old Helmut Schmidt line. So the consequences of the pacifist talk and saying, I enjoy young people demonstrating for peace is not to do in retrospect the right thing. And I fear the SPD at the moment is not ready to do the right thing, and using references to Willy Brandt appeals to the party emotional commitment, but might lead to the wrong policy.
Let me jump in right away on that, whether we can. Yes, you're right, but that's why the SPD lost power. It lost power in 1982 precisely because it wasn't supportive enough of its own chancellor, and he was overthrown, and the SPD was out of power for 16 years afterwards. So they need to think about that. It was precisely their pacifism that lost them power then.
much more to be explored there. So let's take another few questions, please. Your ice cream is coming.
Hi, my name is Luke, and I'm, I think, the first just American student to ask a question. So I'm going to ask a very fitting America-focused question, of course, not to be stereotypical, but kind of in the framing of the talk, right? It's all about Trump and what Trump said with regards to NATO. And so I guess I was wondering, to what extent do you view this pressure that Europe is under currently as an essentially Trumpian phenomenon, as opposed to, or I suppose, how much lasting power do you think it will have after, 4 years from now, once Trump is out of the picture one way or the other? Because we've seen, and maybe this is just me reassuring myself, but we've seen strong bipartisan support in the Congress for NATO, including the addition of a provision to the Defense Procurement Act saying the president is not allowed to unilaterally leave NATO. I mean, of course, you could challenge that, whatever, we'll see. But my impression from an American perspective is that it's really a Trumpian thing, and the rest of the US, broadly speaking, is more in favor of NATO. Do you think that's also seen that way in Europe, or do you think that it's kind of poisoned and the US is not going to be a reliable partner ever again?
Got it.
Could I just ask if anybody else has a related question, something about the US angle on all of this? Yeah, please.
You kind of questioned my question.
I apologize.
No, it's all right. My name is John Tojon, and I'm a SAIS graduate from the previous century. I teach a course here on global banking. And there's kind of like an ironic elephant in the room, and that is the American election.
Yeah.
And the irony here is if Trump gets elected, first of all, he'll take credit for the rearmament of Europe. And he will say, there have been 12 presidents before me who couldn't get this done, and I got it done, and it's going to save the American taxpayer $3 trillion over the next decade. But if Biden wins, will that cause kind of a calmness and a reversal of the direction that Europe seems to be heading in?
Very good. Paul, would you like to come back on this too?
Thank you. Yeah, so look, I think the pressure is more than Trump. You know, the pressure has been sustained during the Biden years, not in the same way of publicly beating up on the allies, you know, treating them like enemies. You know, arguably, Biden sort of folded on American opposition to the Nord Stream gas pipeline, and you know, who's to say whether he was right or wrong? In the end, it's moot since the gas pipeline never came into effect, but it did an awful lot of damage in terms of making Germany and Europe in general more vulnerable to Russian energy blackmail. Yes, how lasting? Well, you know, as I say, it started before, you know, the upward curve of European defense spending started in 2014. It continued on up under Trump, one. It has continued on up under Biden. We're now at the point where 18 of the 31 NATO allies are spending 2% or more of their GDP on defense, and many others are getting close. So, you know, it has been a bipartisan effort from the United States. You know, Trump was not the first president to whine about burden sharing. You know, I'm old enough to have covered this in the 80s, and even in believe it, of the 70s. You know, so this has been a constant U.S. refrain. But Trump is the first president to have threatened essentially to leave NATO. First president ever. And yes, it's true that, you know, legislation has been built in to make it impossible for the president to leave NATO. But, you know, Trump can cause sufficient damage to NATO without actually leaving it. You know, if a US president were to say, well, I'm not going to push the button if the Russians go into X or Y, you know, that is almost irreparably undermining NATO's deterrence. Whether you still have a NATO, whether you still have a United States in it or not, you know, everybody will adjust, including the hard men in the Kremlin who only understand power. So from that point of view, yes, you know, Trump can do an awful lot of damage, and who knows what will be still left in 4 years' time if his term runs for 4 years. He could, of course, get re-elected after 4 years, although he'll be quite an elderly gentleman by then. You know, but so yes, he could.
Really, I thought 8 years.
It's up in the air from a constitutional perspective, whether or not it's.
I thought, you know, you could only serve 8 years and then consecutive, right? But, you know, like many things in the US, it never turns out to be not quite what you thought it was.
He's got the Supreme Court behind him anyway.
Exactly.
We see now.
Yes, you know, let Trump take all the credit he wants for getting Europe to, you know, move its ass and you know, yes. He deserves a bit. He does deserve a bit because, you know, it takes some kind of shock therapy. But I think the shock therapy has not just come from him; it's come from the situation. It's come from Putin. And you know, the combination of Putin and Trump was where I started my talk. This sort of pincer movement, and you know, you could take a third thing, which I think is a longer term perspective historically. You know, for a long time, we Europeans believed in our civilian way that the world was going in our direction, that brotherly love, multilateral governance with the supranational supervision and so on was the way of the future. And sometime, you know, and it appeared that way after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Everything was going our way, enlargement. You know, there were lots of parts of the world that wanted to be like us. CIAN wanted to be something like us, not necessarily as democratic or as you know, ruling of sovereignty, but lots of areas in Latin America too. Lots of people, places in Africa. The African Commission is an extraordinary kind of monument to European soft power in a way, ineffective though it is. And that sort of broke down at some point. I personally sort of dated to when we failed to get the agreement on climate change in Copenhagen in 2009. That was, countries like India rebelled and said, we don't want to play by your rules. India and China, these were the new powers, the emerging powers, as we called them, the rising powers, and they didn't want to play by our rules. And it's taken us a while to recognize this. We still thought that the Brussels effect and so on, if they build widgets to our specifications, then surely, but it hasn't worked that way. History has not gone that way. And, sometimes we have to draw the consequences from that. Next.
Well, very last question or two, Robert.
I have a few questions, but if possible, I'll leave it just to two. My first question has to do with multilateral cooperation within Europe outside of the EU and forums such as the Weimar Triangle. Do you think that's more feasible with cooperating without having to go through the EU? And then my second question, and it kind of builds on what Professor Gilbert asked and what Hannah asked, which has to deal with there's this need for more investment in defense clearly within Europe. And at the same time, there's these large welfare states within the European Union and these two things can't really coexist from my perspective, especially in terms of the physical space available for European governments, not only in Germany, but in other states. Does there have to be a rethink of how governments interact with their citizens in order to have more investment in security? And how do you see that playing out? Thanks.
That's a very interesting question, Robert. Thank you. That's two very interesting questions. Do we want to take?
No, I think that's pretty much.
That's it. Robert gets the last two curveballs. So the multilateral cooperation within the EU or outside the EU, yeah, I think coalitions of the willing is one of the ways in which it'll go. It would be great if we can get a real leadership triangle pulling in the same direction within the EU of Germany, France, and Poland, that therefore brings together Western Europe, old Western Europe, and new Central Europe, that brings together what's going to be actually the three biggest military powers in the EU, because Poland is rapidly becoming a serious military power, and it's spending, nearer to 4% of GDP on defense than 2%. And it's going to have a tank force that will be larger than the combined tank forces of France, Germany, Italy, and the UK. Just the Polish tank force, if they can afford it. But they've ordered it. So yes, I think that would be a potent way both of driving the EU forward and of providing the nucleus of a coalition of the willing when other countries didn't want to come along, and a way of getting around the unanimity rule and so on. And I think all of that, I'm a kind of, pragmatist on this. Tony Blair used to say, what works is what's right. It's sort of, Mao used to say, let 1,000 flowers blossom. I'm more of a Blairist than a Maoist, but you see my direction of travel. So yes, I think that is one of the ways to go, and whatever works, we should go for, and probably doing things through the machinery of the EU, certainly when it comes to actually running serious military operations and so on, is unlikely. We're unlikely to use the EU mechanisms. We may use it for peacekeeping operations, for small scale rescue operations, things like that. Maritime patrol operations. Those may well be run under an EU flag and so on, using the European military staff and so on. But I think hard power being used in anger, in combat, will not happen, in my view, under an official EU flag, or not through the EU structures as they exist. Does the need for more investment in defense mean that we have to get rid of the welfare state, or downsize radically the welfare states? I don't think so. First of all, I don't think that citizens would go for that. The question that was asked previously was, do we have to increase the welfare state commensurate with that? The answer is obviously no, we can't, nor should we necessarily. Can we make the welfare state more efficient? Well, European countries struggle with that, to try and make it more pushing people into employment, pushing people into education, pushing people into building their skills, rather than keeping them on the dole or whatever. It's a difficult challenge, regardless of the military issue. But where are the potential sources of finance that we need? Well, there is potential sources in the private sector which are not being invested in defense companies at the moment. We can change the signals, we can change the Pavlovian stimuli so as to make that happen. And I think that you'll hear a lot about that from Thierry Breton tomorrow. It's not uncontroversial, because the tree huggers don't like it. War is dirty, not good for the climate on the whole, having a war. And therefore making the weapons of war probably not terribly good for the climate either, so there will be pushback. But the other thing is collective borrowing, as I said. All wars are run on tick. The United States borrowed huge amounts when it was the war in Vietnam, for example. And that was the time of the Great Society. It was the time when Lyndon Johnson was increasing social programs in a way that hasn't been done since then, really. So I don't think you have to downsize the welfare state, but I do think you do have to. I mean, there are a lot of subsidies going to companies, for example, in Germany and elsewhere, that are not defense related and that could well be cut back. They will howl because they have vested interests. You see what happens if you try to cut subsidies to farmers, insurance and tractors industry. None of this stuff is easy. But I wouldn't start by taking the axe to the welfare state, because the welfare state in Europe is what makes people, binds people into a community.
Thanks for that fantastically clear and comprehensive presentation, Paul. Thanks for the photographer and technician who made it all happen. Thanks for coming. Come back soon, Paul. Thanks for the question.
Yes. No.